Hey everybody, welcome to the Bearded Bible Thinker podcast. Today I ran across an article that I think is really important actually for right now as we are getting closer and closer to these presidential elections and everything that is the craziness of that. So I ran across an article. It is from the Pew Research .org site. There, Pew Research, for any of you who don't know, Pew Research is an organization that does a lot of polling. They're kind of like Barna, or they do a lot of research, and typically Barna and Pew Research are both places that you can trust. They're really good when it comes to things like polls or studies that they do, and they kind of span across a wide variety of things. But I ran across this one article, and it's super important for where we're at right now. The article title is Key Things to Know About Election Polling in the United States. So why this is important is because we get told over and over and over and over and over again on a very regular basis that the polls say this, the polls say that, this poll says this, well, this poll says that, right? And so how do you wade through that? How do you even know, man, what in the world is believable and what is not, and how does this even work? And this article is actually pretty helpful. I didn't read all the way through it, but we're just going to tackle it a little bit and walk through it real quick. It says, so the title again is Key Things to Know About Election Polling in the United States. It says, a robust public polling industry is a marker of a free society. It's a testament to the ability of organizations outside the government to gather and publish information about the well-being of the public and citizens' views on major issues. In nations without robust polling, the head of government can simply decrease citizens' wants and needs instead. So this is actually pretty important. It's part of being free in where we live, and the polling idea is important. It is how we express our opinions. It's how other people see what the vast majority thinks or believes, or how close that call is when it comes to issues that we all care about. So polling is kind of an important thing. And so when you hear in the news, this poll or that poll says this, you want to be able to understand polling a little bit. You want to be able to trust polling a little bit, but you need to know how polling works to be able to have any sort of data that makes any sense. So the short answer is you cannot believe, just like all the things that I talk about, you can't simply believe that this poll or this news about this poll and what it says is accurate. You can't just believe that, because 90% of the time, just like we've talked about these news outlets, whether it's Fox or the other side, because it seems to be that there's Fox and the other side, which is all these other major networks, and both of them are going to show polls that make the most sense for their cause, for what they're trying to portray, what they're trying to get you to believe and sway your thoughts. So it says this: after the 2016 presidential election, some observers understandably questioned whether polling in the United States is still up to the task of producing accurate information. Errors in 2016 laid bare some real limitations of polling, even as clear-eyed reviews of national polls in both 2016 and 2018 found that polls still perform well when done carefully. So what that's talking about, I don't know the actual percentages or anything, but I do know that the polls overwhelmingly, the polls said Hillary Clinton was just going to win, that Donald Trump had literally, a fighting chance is just not something that existed. He was more than an underdog. He was an underwear dog, right? Like there's no way he was going to be seen. There's no way he was going to win. It just wasn't going to happen. It was like this guy, I forget his name, and it's, I guess, not important for this morning, but there's a guy that was hired to guess, I guess, to give his take on who was going to win, and and this guy had not been wrong before on an election, and he gave Donald Trump like a 10% chance or an 8%, something like that, of winning, which means 90%, right, is going to be Hillary's going to win, right? And these are all polls that were coming out, and this is why it's important to understand polls and the limitations of it, because obviously that all meant nothing. I mean, there some from 90-10, Hillary's going to win, and for all the major polls to say this is just going to happen, for that to be true, and then the opposite occurs, then Donald Trump wins the electoral college, then it really calls into question, what do you believe when it comes to polls, right? Polls, actually, for me personally, I didn't understand polls at all really at the time. I knew there had to be some variation. There's this thought that always pops into my head that says, well, they didn't ask me, right? So it can't be completely accurate because they didn't ask every human being on the planet. That's the only way you're going to have an actual poll that matters, and that poll happens to be the election itself. So that at the end of the day, it made some folks lose confidence a little bit in this whole idea of polling. So article, we're just going to continue. It says this: one way to help avoid a repeat of the skepticism about surveys that followed the last presidential election is to narrow the gap between perception and reality when it comes to how polling works. People have many notions about polling, often based on an introductory statistics class, but sometimes even less, that are frequently false. The real environment in which polls are conducted bears little resemblance to the idealized settings presented in textbooks. With that in mind, here are some key points the public should know about polling heading into this year's presidential elections. Okay, so thing one. Different polling organizations conduct their surveys in quite different ways. Survey methodology is undergoing a period of creative ferment. Currently, CNN and Fox News conduct polls by telephone using live interviews. CBS News and Politico field their polls online using opt-in panels. And the Associated Press and Pew Research Center conduct polls. The Pew Research Center, this is their story, this is their thing. The Associated Press and Pew Research Center conduct polls online using a panel of respondents recruited offline. There's even a fourth group of pollsters that combine methods like robocalls and online surveying with opt-in samples. These different approaches have consequences for data quality as well as accuracy in elections. So, if you listened to me read that and had no idea lost all bearing on where you're at, and you don't know where you're at now, right? You're not alone, because there's a lot of what I just read that I don't understand either. Okay, you really wouldn't unless you really dug into what they're talking about, what all of these things are. The online using opt-in panels. What does that even mean? How does that work? But the point they want you to get out of this is that different polling organizations conduct their surveys in quite different ways. And that's important because how a poll is conducted is a factor in how a poll will come out, how what the samples are going to say, what the polling is the information that's going to end with. In some ways is partially determined by how you do it. And that's the case for really everything under the sun, right? How you parent is going to make some sort of determining factor in how your youngsters turn out, right? I mean, this is just kind of natural. It makes sense. So that's not hard to grasp. Different polling organizations conduct their surveys in quite different ways. The second thing, it says this: the barriers to entry in the polling field have disappeared. Okay, so The barriers to entry in the polling field have disappeared. So, technology has disrupted polling in ways similar to its impact on journalism by making it possible for anyone with a few $1,000s to enter the. Yeah, okay, yeah. So honestly, it wouldn't even take that. Like I could actually get on Facebook, and I know nothing. I don't have an organization or anything. I could get on Facebook and create a poll, and if it's marketed well enough, if I get it out there well enough, then I could say that I conducted a national survey. And what does that even mean? Like, so that's a fair point, and that's a point that is true about news, and anybody with a blog can seem like an expert. Anybody with a YouTube channel can seem like an expert. So that's a real issue, and that makes sense to me that the barriers to entering the polling field have disappeared. So just like this has affected lots of different things. So let's see. This is in 2016. This contributed to a state polling landscape overrun with fast and cheap polls, most of which made a preventable mistake, failing to correct for an over-presentation of college-educated voters who leaned heavily toward Hillary Clinton. Some newcomer polls might provide good data, but poll watchers should not take that on faith. So what they're really saying is that there are things that you don't get maybe and like they said earlier, in an introductory statistics class, that there's a science behind polling that the average Joe just shouldn't be messing with. It's not going to be accurate because there's so many different factors, but because of technology and because of the world that we live in today, which is amazing, that I'm glad that I couldn't be doing what I'm doing now, which is really just a way for me to blow off steam and and hopefully just have some people hear my thoughts on stuff, I guess. But I couldn't be doing what I'm doing right now if the technology had not disrupted polling in ways similar to. So it's a thing, regardless whether you think it's good or bad. It has made an impact on the accuracy of polling. A poll may label itself, quote, nationally representative, end quote, but that's not a guarantee that its methodology is solid. So again, that just goes to, I'm not even going to really get into that because that makes sense. I've already kind of said that like I could say that I polled the whole nation on Facebook because it was open to the whole nation, and I had one guy from Georgia that chimed in, right? So the misuse of polls, I think, is a legitimate thing that could be talked about more. But just because a poll says nationally in the title, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's accurate or that it's actually national, or that the poller had any clue what they're doing. So this is actually a really important one, this next one. The real margin of error is often about double the one reported. The real margin of error is often about double the one reported. So the notion that a typical margin of error is plus or minus 3 percentage points leads people to think that the polls are more precise than they really are. Why is that? For starters, the margin of error addresses only one source of potential error: the fact that random samples are likely to differ a little from the population just by chance. But there are 3 other equally important sources of error polling: non-response, coverage error, where not all the target population has a chance of being sampled. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Non-response, coverage error, and mismeasurement. Not only does the margin of error fail to account for those other sources of potential error, it implies to the public that they do not exist, which is not true. So several recent studies show that the average error in a poll estimate may be closer to 6 percentage points, not the 3 points implied by a typical margin of error. So what that means is that that there's a 6% chance, essentially, that this poll might be off by 6%, give or take. That's the idea. behind that. And that's actually really important because even the good polls, what they're saying here is that even the polls that are done in a super scientific way, that check all the boxes, that dot all the I's and cross all the T's, even those polls are not completely accurate. And no poll can be. Like I said, even the election poll can't be completely accurate because there's actually quite a huge percentage of American voters that aren't voting, that they have never registered to vote. So they're not American voters. There's a huge population in America that just has never voted and doesn't intend to most of the time. So you can't actually get, and listen, if that's you, don't do that. Don't do that. In this day and age, honestly, if you don't vote, you're voting for whatever side ends up winning, right? Like so I'll give you an example that really is close to me, and I've said this many times on this podcast, that in this day and age, like if you don't vote, the way that things are going, if you don't vote, you're voting for abortion. If you don't vote, you're voting for the abolition of male and female. There are so many things that, look, if you don't vote, you're voting for whoever ends up winning. You're voting for whoever ends up maybe that's enough of a statement. If you don't vote, you're voting for whoever ends up winning. So shut up and take it, right? And whatever happens, deal with the consequences, and you don't get to whine about it. That's just, I guess, my opinion. But that's what this is for, right? So I can spout off my opinion in the most tactful way that I know how, anyway. So average error in a poll estimate may be closer to 6 percentage points, not 3. Okay, here's another one. Huge sample sizes sound impressive, but sometimes they don't mean much. Students learning about surveys are generally taught that a very large sample size is a sign of quality because it means that the results are more precise. While that principle remains true in theory, the reality of modern polling is different. As Nat Cohn of the New York Times has explained, quote, often the polls with huge samples are actually just using cheap and problematic sampling methods, end quote. Adding more interviews from a biased source. Okay, that's what they're talking about. So here's the deal. If I have a huge poll, and I poll every, and I get responses from every sophomore and junior student at UC Berkeley, and that's my poll, well then there's no chance Trump is winning. Literally, it's well, if that's the poll, even though there might be thousands of people that have responded, it depends on your the idea is you have to sample a large scope of different socioeconomic, different races, different religions, different genders, different of the two genders, and all of these things. You have to sample. The sample has to be robust and include many different facets, many different types of people in the United States, not just one side and one kind of person, one rich people only, or you know what I mean? Like, so that's a real issue as well. So this idea that well, like this guy from I can't believe I'm quoting someone from the New York Times and saying that makes sense, because, well, that's a problem. Quote, often the polls with huge samples are actually just using cheap and problematic sampling methods. That's true. So adding more and more interviews from a biased source does not improve estimates. For example, online opt-in polls are based on convenience samples that tend to overrepresent adults who self-identify as Democrats, live alone, do not have children, and have lower incomes. So there you go. Next thing, there's evidence that when the public is told that a candidate is extremely likely to win, some people may be less likely to vote. Ooh, so polls are actually something that people put in holsters. That's what that's saying, and that's true. If there's just straight up in your mind no chance that your person is going to win, or if there's no chance your person is going to lose, you might just think, let's just stay home. It's over anyway, right? And look at me. Hey, if that was you in 2016, right? The polls were used in that 2016 election, and they're going to be used in this election. There are Republicans. I'll just say this. It doesn't matter what side you're on. Don't hear me whining about your side, okay? But there are Republicans right now that see Joe Biden ahead in some polls, and the idea is, how is that possible? The man can't read a sentence, right? And so there's this struggle, right? And so, but what that's actually going to do, frankly, is it's going to bring more and more and more people who agree with the things and are impressed with the things that Donald Trump has actually accomplished. It's going to bring more of those people out of the woodwork that maybe didn't vote or didn't care to vote last time. So I think that's actually a bad thing for Joe Biden, but I am certainly not an expert by any stretch of the imagination on any of this stuff. It's just, it seems to me that might be a bad deal overall. But the polls are weaponized. They really are, because if like I said, if you just are convinced that your candidate is going to win, or you're already convinced that your candidate is going to lose, you might feel defeated and like, you know what, whatever, just forget about it. Let's just watch Everybody Loves Raymond today, right? Instead of vote. And so that is a real thing. That is a real thing. Estimates of the public's views of candidates and major policies are generally trustworthy, but estimates of who will win the horse race are less so. I could see that. Let's see here. All good polling relies on statistical adjustment called weighting. That's WEIGHTING, weighting, to make sure that samples align with the broader population on key characteristics. That sounds complex. Historically, public opinion researchers have relied on the ability to adjust their data sets using a core set of demographics to correct imbalances. Okay, so you're using based on the demographics of those who are physically represented in your polling data. You're taking that and calculating somehow, some person who actually is using that math class that they took. They're calculating in the overall demographics of the United States. So that makes sense to me. So there are more of these things, and I'm just gonna kind of speed through the rest of them. But these are all okay. We'll just go to the next one here real quick. So failing to adjust for survey respondents' education level is a disqualifying shortfall in present-day battleground and national polls. Okay. For a long time in U.S. politics, education level was not consistently correlated with partisan choice, but that is changing, especially among white voters. As a result, it's increasingly important for poll samples to accurately reflect the composition of the electorate when it comes to educational attainment, since people with higher levels of formal education are more likely to participate in surveys and to self-identify as Democrats. Okay, so it has to do with the likelihood of participation, and which could change. Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Which could actually change the level of accuracy in the survey. Okay, transparency in how a poll was conducted is associated with better accuracy. The polling industry has several platforms and initiatives aimed at promoting transparency in how polls are conducted. That actually makes a lot of sense. That if you're not afraid to tell people how the poll was conducted, how you got your information, then people are more likely to be able to trust that poll. If you don't want to reveal that, this is a tactic that people in the media on either side use all the time, right? You pull little blurbs of what an actual you pull things out of context, right? And it's kind of the same thing, right? If you pull a statement out of context and air it and then cut it off before any more explanation is given, then you're going to be able to paint that statement in whatever light you want, right? So context is a real thing that needs to be taken into account. So if you're, and I say that to say this, if you're a company that does polling and you are forthcoming with the context of your poll, how that is, how you polled, who you polled, how it worked, then you're probably forthcoming with that because your poll is being done well and honestly. If you want to hide that, if you want to just hide the context, hide the information, hide how you got it, if you want to do that, then that probably means it's not that trustworthy. So that makes sense. The problems with state polls in 2016 do not mean that polling overall is broken. Yes, polls in the upper Midwest systematically underestimated support for Trump, but experts figured out why. Undecided voters ultimately broke heavily for Trump. Most state polls overrepresented college graduates, and turnout was higher than expected in many rural counties, but lower in urban ones. Lost in the shuffle, meanwhile, was that national polls in 2016 were quite accurate by historical standards. Clinton's advantage in the national popular vote ended up being 2 percentage points compared with 3 points in the final polling average. The 2018 midterms brought further evidence that polling still works when done carefully. So let's see. Now, this is a good article actually, and I'm gonna kind of wrap it up because we're getting pretty close on time, and I like to keep these under 30 minutes. But this is an important concept to grasp, right? You don't have to understand all the stuff I just read. I don't understand all the stuff I just read, but the point is the polls that you're going to get in the news on either side. I have to keep saying that because Fox is not any better. If you're listening to me in this podcast, you're probably some form of Republican. But I have to. Fox News is no better. They're just the opposite in their bias. But the polls that you're going to get in the national news are polls that, they're polls that are skewed. They're going to find polls and probably not check how they came up with these numbers. They're going to find polls that say what they want you to hear and use those polls. That's how it works. They're gonna find this is why you have the president may be using some statistical facts about the coronavirus, and then meanwhile the very same topic has some other statistics that people are using, because the statistics there are books entitled How to Lie with Statistics, right? Like it's not difficult to get what you want out in your message. So context is important. Understand that the polls that are in the news are likely, at least to some degree, pretty untrustworthy, and try to find places that you can trust polls that you see. Those are going to be important. Or just don't find places that have polls that you feel like you can actually trust, and make sure that you vote. right? Like be a part of that poll, right? So anyway, I hope that you all have a wonderful week. I'll see you again tomorrow, and let's think about it.